Many TOEFL candidates lose points in the writing section, not because they can't write in English, but because they are not prepared for the topics that come up. Here's the truth. There are certain themes you are likely to encounter in the academic discussion task. If you prepare vocabulary, grammar structures, and key ideas for these topics in advance, you can be in a much stronger position on test day. We've helped thousands of students prepare this way through our TOEFL packages. With clear steps and strategic preparation, they've turned confusion into confidence. In this video, we'll go through 10 TOEFL writing topics for the academic discussion task. You will get useful vocabulary and sample phrases for each one. By the end, you'll know what to prepare for the academic discussion task. Let's get started. In the academic discussion task, a professor posts a question about an academic topic, and two students share their opinions. You need to contribute your own view to the discussion clearly and with strong support. Topic number 1 is technology and society. For this topic, you might be asked whether social media does more harm than good to younger generations. In other cases, the question could be whether governments should regulate how much data technology companies may collect. You might also be asked whether people today rely too heavily on technology for everyday tasks and decisions. To write a high-scoring response on this topic, express your position clearly and support it with a well-developed reason and a specific example. Do not simply agree with one of the student posts. Try to add something new to the conversation. Here is some useful vocabulary for this topic: digital well-being, data privacy, technological dependence, social connectivity, filter information critically. For grammar, use concessive clauses to show a balanced perspective. For example, although social media has made it much easier for people to stay in touch across distances, it has also created an environment in which negative comparisons and unrealistic expectations can spread quickly. This kind of structure shows that you can think critically and express a nuanced position clearly. You can also use conditional sentences to explore possible consequences. If governments were to introduce stricter regulations on data collection, companies would likely need to rethink their business model significantly. These structures can help you score higher by showing a strong command of complex grammar. The second topic is education and learning methods. The professor might ask about changes to how students learn and what teaching approaches are most effective. You could be asked whether online learning is as effective as in-person classes. In some cases, the question might be about whether universities should require students to study a broader range of subjects or focus only on their major. You might also be asked whether homework at the primary school level is beneficial or unnecessary. High-scoring responses on this topic do more than state an opinion. They develop the reasoning behind it with a specific example or piece of evidence that connects to the argument clearly. Here is some useful vocabulary for this topic: critical thinking skills, collaborative learning, academic outcomes, instructional approach, engage with the material. For grammar, practice using result clauses to strengthen your argument. For example, the shift to online classes during the past few years meant that many students missed out on the kind of real-time interaction with instructors that can make difficult concepts much easier to understand. You can also use relative clauses to add detail. In-person learning, which allows students to ask questions and discuss ideas with their peers immediately, tends to produce a richer learning experience. These structures help make your response sound more advanced and well-developed. Topic number 3 is environmental issues. In academic discussions about this theme, the professor may ask students to weigh the costs and benefits of different approaches to protecting the environment. You might be asked whether individuals or corporations bear more responsibility for addressing climate change. In other cases, the question could focus on whether governments should introduce financial penalties for environmentally harmful behavior. You could also be asked whether countries should prioritize economic growth or environmental protection when those two goals seem to conflict. To do well on this topic, you need to take a clear position and develop it with a specific example or logical reasoning. Vague statements like "everyone should care about the environment" will not score well. Instead, be precise about who should act and why. Here is some useful vocabulary for this topic: carbon footprint, sustainable practices, renewable energy, environmental regulation, long-term consequences. For grammar, use modal verbs to discuss responsibilities and possibilities. For example, corporations should be required to offset their carbon emissions, since they produce a far greater share of global pollution than individual consumers do. You can also use comparatives to strengthen your argument. Systemic policy changes tend to produce more significant results than individual behavioral shifts, even when both are important. This level of precision in language can help your response stand out. Here is another topic you may encounter in the academic discussion task: work and career. The professor might ask about changes in how people approach their working lives, or about what employers and employees value most. For example, you might be asked whether it is better to have one stable career or to change careers multiple times throughout your life. You could also be asked whether remote work is beneficial for both employees and companies. Another possible question is whether universities do enough to prepare students for the demands of the modern workplace. The key to scoring well on this topic is to go beyond general statements. Do not just say remote work is good. Instead, explain a specific benefit, give a reason for it, and support it with an example or a piece of evidence. Here is some useful vocabulary for this topic: work-life balance, career trajectory, workplace flexibility, job satisfaction, employee well-being. For grammar, practice using conditional sentences to explore different scenarios. For example, if companies offered more flexible working arrangements, they would likely see an improvement in employee retention and overall productivity. You can also use contrast structures to show that you understand more than one side of the issue. While the freedom of remote work is appealing to many employees, it can also make it harder to build the kind of collaborative team culture that drives innovation. These structures show a strong command of grammar and can help you score higher. Let's move on to topic number 5, health and lifestyle. In the academic discussion task, professors may ask about choices related to personal health, public health policy, and the habits people develop over time. You might be asked whether governments should do more to encourage citizens to adopt healthier diets. You could also be asked whether physical education should be compulsory at the university level, or whether mental health education should be included in school curricula. On this topic, it is important to write with specificity. Saying that health is important is not enough. Describe a specific consequence, connect it to a reason, and use appropriate vocabulary to show that you can discuss the topic in a meaningful way. Here is some useful vocabulary for this topic: public health initiatives, preventable illness, mental well-being, sedentary lifestyle, long-term health outcomes. For grammar, use the present perfect tense to connect past trends to current realities. For example, research has consistently shown that sedentary lifestyles are linked to a range of serious health conditions, which suggests that encouraging regular physical activity from an early age could have significant long-term benefits. You can also use passive voice to sound more objective. It has been argued that the cost of treating preventable illnesses places a considerable burden on public health systems. These structures can help your writing sound more advanced. Now, here is an important point. Many TOEFL candidates think that knowing a few writing topics is enough to achieve a strong result, but it is not enough. To do well in TOEFL writing, you need to understand what the examiner is looking for. For example, you need to use advanced grammar correctly and understand what makes a high-scoring answer. That's exactly what we teach in our TOEFL packages. Our students get step-by-step guidance on how to write strong answers, so they feel confident and ready on test day. They learn how the TOEFL examiners assess their performance and what they need to do to meet the scoring criteria. Our TOEFL packages include lessons for all tasks, sample answers, templates, practice tests, and much more. If you're serious about achieving the TOEFL score you need, click the link below to learn more. Topic number 6 is social issues and community. The academic discussion task can include questions about how people interact with their communities and what responsibilities individuals have towards society. You could be asked whether community service should be a requirement for university graduation. In some cases, the question might focus on whether wealthy individuals have a greater obligation to contribute to society than others do. You might also be asked whether modern cities are becoming too large and whether that growth creates problems for their residents. High-scoring responses on this topic show clear reasoning and a strong connection between the candidate's opinion and the evidence they provide. Develop your point with a real-world example or a logical chain of reasoning that makes your position easy to follow. Here is some useful vocabulary for this topic: civic responsibility, social inequality, community engagement, collective well-being, voluntary participation. For grammar, use purpose clauses to connect actions to their goals. For example, requiring students to complete community service hours before graduating can help them develop a stronger sense of civic responsibility, which is a skill that many employers also value. You can also use contrast structures to add depth. While some argue that volunteering should be entirely voluntary to be meaningful, others believe that structured programs are the most reliable way to ensure that communities receive consistent support. This kind of developed argumentation can help you score higher on the elaboration category, which refers to how well you support and develop your ideas in the discussion. The 7th topic is cultural and global issues. This theme covers questions about how different cultures interact, how globalization is changing the world, and what it means to preserve cultural identity. You might be asked whether globalization has had a more positive or negative impact on local cultures. You could also be asked whether students should be required to study a foreign language as part of their education. Another possible question is whether international travel should be encouraged as a way to build cross-cultural understanding. On this topic, it is important to avoid overly general statements. Be specific about which cultural changes you are referring to and explain why you see them as a benefit or a concern. Specificity is what separates a developed response from a vague one. Here is some useful vocabulary for this topic: cultural identity, cross-cultural understanding, global interconnectedness, linguistic diversity, cultural exchange. For grammar, use result clauses to show how one development leads to another. For example, the widespread availability of global media platforms has made it far easier for people to access content from other cultures, with the result that younger generations are growing up with a much more international perspective than previous generations did. You can also use conditional sentences to consider what might happen under different circumstances. If more schools incorporated foreign language study into their core curricula, students would likely develop greater empathy for people from different cultural backgrounds. These structures help your argument sound well developed and precise. By the way, if you want this channel to keep going, write yes in the comments, click like and subscribe. We only make videos that you actually want to watch. Now, let's look at 3 more topics that may appear on the TOEFL. Another topic that can appear in the academic discussion task is science and research. Professors teaching courses in areas like sociology, economics, or public policy may ask questions that touch on how society uses and funds scientific knowledge. You might be asked whether governments should increase funding for basic scientific research, even when the practical benefits are not immediately clear. You could also be asked whether the results of academic research should be made freely available to the public, or whether companies should have the right to keep research findings private. In other cases, the question might focus on whether scientific evidence is given enough weight in public policy decisions. To score well on this topic, make sure your argument is well organized and that your example directly supports your main claim. A common mistake is including an example that is interesting but does not clearly connect to the argument being made. Here is some useful vocabulary for this topic: empirical evidence, publicly funded research, scientific literacy, peer-reviewed findings, applied versus theoretical research. For grammar, use passive voice to discuss research findings in an objective way. For example, it has been well established through decades of publicly funded research that investment in basic science often leads to significant technological breakthroughs in the long term, even when the short-term applications are not obvious. You can also use relative clauses. Climate science, which has been supported by publicly funded institutions for many years, is one example of how government investment in research can lead to knowledge that affects the entire world. This level of detail and structure can help your response score higher on the elaboration category. Topic number 9 is urban life and infrastructure. This theme explores questions about how cities are designed and managed and what trade-offs come with rapid urbanization. For example, you might be asked whether city governments should invest more heavily in public transportation or focus on other infrastructure needs first. You could be asked whether high-rise apartment buildings are an acceptable solution to the challenge of housing a growing urban population. You might also be asked whether green spaces such as parks and forests should be protected even when cities need more land for housing and development. On this topic, think carefully about which side of the argument you want to support and find a concrete example to back it up. Personal experiences, things you have observed, or logical consequences can all work well as supporting evidence. Here is some useful vocabulary for this topic: public infrastructure, urban density, housing affordability, sustainable urban planning, green spaces. For grammar, use comparatives to evaluate different approaches. For example, investing in an efficient public transportation network tends to have a broader positive impact on a city's quality of life than expanding road infrastructure does, particularly in cities where traffic congestion is already a serious problem. You can also use concessive clauses. Although expanding public transit requires a significant upfront investment, the long-term reduction in congestion and pollution tends to make such projects worthwhile for most cities. These structures help you engage with the complexity of the issue and can work in your favor when the examiner assesses how well you develop your argument. The 10th topic is values, ethics, and decision-making. This is a broad theme that covers questions about how individuals and organizations should behave when faced with difficult choices. It often appears in courses on philosophy, sociology, or business. You might be asked whether honesty is always the best policy, even when the truth could cause harm. You could also be asked whether companies have a moral responsibility to consider the well-being of their employees alongside their financial performance. Another possible angle is whether it is ethical to use animals in scientific research if the goal is to benefit human health. This type of topic requires you to take a clear position and explain the reasoning behind it carefully. Avoid giving answers that are overly simple or one-sided without acknowledging the complexity of the issue. Showing that you understand more than one perspective while still making your own position clear is a sign of a well-developed response. Here is some useful vocabulary for this topic: ethical considerations, moral responsibility, decision-making framework, competing interests, justify an action. For grammar, use modal verbs to discuss obligations and possibilities in a measured way. For example, companies should be expected to weigh the impact of their decisions on employees, not just on shareholders, because the long-term success of any business depends on having a motivated and committed workforce. You can also use complex noun clauses to add depth to your writing. What makes ethical decision-making so challenging is that there is often no single answer that satisfies every value we hold at the same time. This kind of sentence structure shows a strong command of grammar and can help your overall score. That's it. These are 10 topics for the TOEFL Academic Discussion Task. If you want expert guidance for your TOEFL preparation, check out our TOEFL packages using the link below. Our packages include step-by-step guidance, sample answers, templates, practice tests, and other useful resources to help you feel confident on test day. I hope you liked this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you're notified when the next video comes out. Also, share this video with your friends so they can improve their TOEFL score too. See you in the next video!